Good afternoon, Madam Chair. We have a quorum.
Okay.
Did we confirm a quorum?
We have, yes,
We
we
have-
have confirmed quorum.
Okay, apologies. I think y'all were saying that and I was on the wrong speaker system, so. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll start with item number 2, approval of September 23rd, 2024 meeting summary. Everyone's good. If I could get a motion to
Motion
approve the
to approve.
minutes. Thank you, Bob. And a second?
This is Kathy. I'll second it.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Thank you. Anyone opposed? Awesome. Minutes passed. We'll move to item number 3 under information and update on the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. Pass it over to Will.
Thank you. This information item serves as an update on CAMPO's development of the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan, the RTP. Previous updates to TAC have included a discussion of the purpose of the RTP and the overall timeline, a discussion of goals and objectives that are associated with the plan, as well as describing the project call process that for the project call process open. We provided a summary of the received projects after the conclusion of the project call. And just last month, we reviewed a revenue estimation methodology for the plan. The update today will include draft results of the revenue estimation process for fiscal constraint, as well as revisiting the timeline, just to remind folks of how we're going to get the plan passed by the board in May, as well as a discussion of public outreach efforts. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Allison Fluitt with Kimberly Horn to talk about the results of our revenue estimation.
Thank you, Will. Just confirming you all can hear me all right. All right, great.
Yep, we can.
So as Will mentioned, we did briefly want to recap our process to reach fiscal constraint. We appreciate the committee's attention last month as we kind of started down this path. But as Will mentioned, we have already undertaken the project call and received applications, and we thank everybody for the time and effort that you put in to that application process. On the CAMPO side, we've had the opportunity to move through the project scoring for those applications that were received and assemble a prioritized project list. And the corollary for that is the revenue forecasting exercise. So we need to be kind of taking a look at our overall revenues in order to move into the determination of fiscal constraint. And where that's ultimately going to be taking us is in that comparison of our available revenues to our stated needs. We're going to be determining our constrained projects and our illustrative projects for inclusion in the RTP. So on the next slide, we just want to provide a little bit more of that background on the revenue forecasting process, because this is what essentially enables the determination of our fiscal constraint, which is obviously a federal requirement of the RTP. Something that I think is important to note, and we mentioned this last time, but it bears repeating, is that when we report on this within the RTP, we are reviewing this as a regional constraint. So this is not something that is reported on in an individual jurisdictional basis. But for the development of our revenue forecasting process, we look at this in 4 different areas. So you'll see on the next slide kind of an overview of what those areas are. And we'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail and provide you some insight into kind of where we went from parlaying that methodology that we outlined to you in our last TAC meeting, and where that is kind of ending up in terms of some draft revenue projections. So looking at this from a federal and state funding perspective, our available transit revenues, specifically to our tolling agencies, and then finally those local jurisdictional revenues. But let's start on the next slide with our federal and state revenues. And this is a place where we want some, I think, particular kind of attention as we go through the process, because we're outlining a 4-step process here. And this is a little bit different than perhaps some of the approaches that have been considered in the past. So our first step is to essentially consider the federal and state revenues from our current fiscal year 25 to 28 TIP. So anything that's already been stated in the TIP, we want to just carry forward as is. Now you'll notice our second step is highlighted. That's because this is where we've seen a bit of a deviation from how this has been handled in other instances. So for our second step, we wanted to consider historic revenue levels. And specifically, we looked at the revenue levels that were available during the years of the FAST Act legislation specific to this region. So I want to provide a little bit more perspective here. In our last meeting, we talked about the trends model. Now, the trends model is just that. It's a tool that is developed by TTI. It's something that is available for use for our MPOs as a tool, as a resource for forecasting revenues for your regional transportation plan. This is just one of many approaches that folks can choose to use. And we looked at the trends model as a part of our process. And one of the things that we wanted to be observant to is just understanding the funding levels that we're seeing coming out of that, and then comparing it to what we think might be a reasonable expectation of future funds. So again, I'll actually talk in just a moment on the next slide about the comparison that we see between the trends model and then the approach that we are suggesting. But we wanted to look at the revenue levels that we're seeing in FAST Act, because when we look at the current funding levels, we're obviously in the IIJA and a framework at the moment. Considering those revenues and just forecasting them as it is may be overly aggressive. What we've heard is that that may not be realistic. They consider that that funding level that is available via IIJA will be expected to continue. So then the question presented itself of, if we were going to scale that back, where is the most appropriate place to scale that back? This has been a question that's been asked statewide. The TxDOT Revenue Forecasting Committee was actually kind of debating this, considering should they look all the way back to the T21 federal legislation, but ultimately they decided that it would make the most sense to kind of proceed with the FAST Act also for the TxDOT Revenue Forecasting Committee. So just kind of thinking about that as a background, we know that this is being discussed at multiple levels in the state. So once we had looked at those historic revenue levels, we essentially say, all right, we want to forecast those beyond the years of the TIP. So we take those years from the TIP as it is, and then we go forward. and apply a 2% revenue inflation value, forecasting that all the way through 2050. So the 2% revenue inflation value is just reflective of some modest growth in revenues. This 2% number is something that we've seen signed off on at the state and federal levels in the past. So we feel good about continuing that 2% escalation. But I wanted to just go back and compare the kind of two different approaches that we considered going forward, which you'll see more about on the next slide. And let me just set the stage with this slide, because we know that there are obviously lots of different categories of funding that are available within the TIP. We are not looking at all of those in this comparison. We are simply looking at the categories that we can pull from the trends model, and then those exact same categories that we can pull using our approach as well. So what we're looking at are category 2, which is our metropolitan and urban area corridor projects. Category 7, metropolitan mobility and rehab. Cat 9 is transportation alternatives set aside, and Cat 11 is district discretionary. So just so you know, those are the categories that we considered here. And again, those are the ones that come straight out of trends, not the total picture of all of our state and federal funding. We just want to show you an apples to apples comparison here. So in looking at what was coming out of the trends model, we saw for these 4 categories, approximately $3.4 billion being projected out through the life of our plan. Now, using the methodology that we showed on the previous slide, which essentially includes our current TIP and then projects out using those FAST Act revenue levels, and then includes that 2% inflation rate kind of going forward, we came in around $7.9 billion. And we felt that this was a more representative number of what we might expect to see available within the region in terms of state and federal funding going forward. This is more conservative than what it would be, obviously, if we just took all of our IIJA and just projected that forward. But we kind of prefer to err on the side of being more conservative where it makes sense, but also trying to be as realistic as we can. So
Allison,
this
if we could
culminates.
I'm sorry, if we could just pause right there. I think before we get too much further, I think Bob has a question.
Please.
Mm-hmm.
Allison, I would just like you to say once again, that you'll have to say every time you give one of these presentations, is that the local dollars are staying local, and that you're not taking money from one jurisdiction and moving it to another jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, good observation, and that is correct. That is definitely an assumption that is embedded within the plan. So thanks for pointing that out, Bob. So let's move on to the next slide, because that kind of puts all of this into the overall perspective for our federal and state revenues specifically. So these are all of our categories, and just looking at the total estimated revenue over all of the categories through 2050, we are looking at a total of a little bit over $17 billion. So again, we just wanted to make sure that we kind of fully explain that methodology, because it is essentially taking us away from the trends tool, but moving us into an approach that we feel very confident with, kind of allowing us to represent some previously available revenues that we have historically seen within this region, and kind of carrying those forward. All right, now let's move into our anticipated transit revenues. So for our anticipated transit revenues, to get to these numbers, we did, as you see, have the opportunity to connect with Cap Metro, as well as ATP and CARTS. And this included gathering the planning information, budget information, and then having some one-on-one conversations as well to just be sure that we were understanding where all of that information was coming from. What we see when we look at transit revenues is a combination of transit capital as well as transit operations and maintenance. And similarly, this is a combination of federal and state funding as well as local funding. So what you see on screen here is also inclusive of the anticipated New Starts funding to support Project Connect. So when you look at these overall revenue levels that are anticipated, it's important to note that that is inclusive of that New Starts funding. The other thing that I think is important to note is that we realize that between several of our transit providers, there is a lot of interconnectivity, both in their operations and in their funding. And so we worked with the transit providers to avoid any double counting, so that we did have kind of a separation in those revenues between all the different transit providers. From there, let's move on into our regional tolling agencies.
If I might, this is Ed Collins. I did have a question
Please.
on the capital metro revenues. I went back and looked at 2040 and 2045, and just even if you look from 2045 to 2050, this is a six-fold increase in the transit revenues. And it's also, in all my experience of in this region, that I've never seen the transit number to be far exceeding the highway revenue numbers. So I'd encourage you to kind of take a look at that again. I'm not sure if we're doing apples to apples from the 2045 and the 2040 plan, but that's a kind of an eye opener to me. In 2040, we only estimated 1.5 billion of total transit revenues. In 2045, it was 5.5 billion. So this is quite a bit of a jump. That just to make sure that we're looking at the right numbers, and for Capital Metro staff to also understand when you start seeing something like that, those type of numbers jump out at a lot of different people that could use it in a way that could be misleading, I guess, and just want to make sure that we have the right assumptions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's something that we'll definitely look back into. So yeah, thank you for that comment. And again, I appreciate any questions or comments that we have at this point. The numbers that we're sharing today are definitely in draft, so that if there are other comments or questions or places where folks see a chance for kind of more follow-up or digging into something else, please feel free to jump in, and we're happy to look further into anything that we share today. All right, moving into the regional tolling agencies. So we did have the opportunity to speak with CTRMA and SH130, as well as with TxDOT at the Austin district. And based on the conversations we had specific to tolling, the takeaways that we had were essentially that our tolling authorities in the region and the facilities for which they are responsible are being treated as a closed system for the purposes of our regional transportation plan. So what that means is that for any expenditures that are taking place on those facilities, the assumption is, for the purpose of this plan, that those are funded in their entirety by revenues generated by the respective tolling authority. So, and we did have some projects that have been submitted, and we discussed those with the tolling agencies. But again, that's the assumption that's being made for the purpose of this plan. And then finally, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but I think this is a great opportunity that in those revenues that maybe we also account for park and ride facilities and other things that could be built in the corridors. We've talked to CTRMA before. They said if you kind of let people know or let them know beforehand on different types of ancillary type projects, so they can add that into their bond, their estimates. And maybe there's another way, instead of using other funding, that toll funding could be used to help do some type of regional improvements that are more than just the filling of the toll road. Again, park and ride lots may be one of those good examples. Thank you.
Thank you. A great comment. All right, so let's move to our next slide, which talks about our local revenues. So for our forecasting methodology for this, and we talked about this in more detail in our last meeting, but essentially the methodology consisted of conversations with our local staff. So we appreciate everybody as a part of this committee that did give your time to speak with us and offer us some insights. Prior to those meetings and following those meetings, we had the opportunity to look into capital investment plans, improvement programs, budget documents where they're available, to kind of pull the current revenue levels or the short range forecasts where funds have been obligated for our local jurisdictions. In addition, one of the primary sources that we have noted as being identified for many of our jurisdictions are bonds. And so just looking into the details of those bonds in terms of whether or not they're exclusively dedicated to transportation, understanding how the frequency with which they're likely to be renewed. This is particularly pertinent for anybody that has a bond that's maybe been issued in the past, and then many of you have had recently renewed bonds or are getting have that on the ballot this year. Where there's been a bond that has been passed successfully in the past, our assumption was that that bond would continue and carry forward. And in the case of those that actually have that on the ballot this year, our assumption was that it would be carried forward at the level that it's being proposed right now. I will note for those that are perhaps seeking a bond for the first time, that is not something that we folded into the estimated revenues for our local jurisdictions. The reason being that for the federal kind of projection, the way in which that's framed is that it's supposed to be a reasonable expectation of future funding levels, which essentially translates to mean that if you've done it in the past, it's likely that you can continue to do it. But if you haven't done it in the past, we should be conservative and not assume that that's going to happen without precedent. So for those places where, let's say you're seeking a bond this election cycle or in a future election cycle, that's something that we would want to document, but that it won't be directly reflected in our numbers. So just something to note. So when we put all of these together, we're looking at an estimated revenue around $21 billion. I'll note that we do have some follow-up conversations just to verify a couple of assumptions with a couple of our jurisdictions. We've already had one of those last week, and we have a couple more that we're hoping to get on the calendar this week. So again, these are draft numbers, but it kind of helps us understand that methodology, and we've tried to have a fairly consistent application of that methodology across all of our local jurisdictions. So taking that to our next slide, we wanted just to provide a sense of our total estimated regional revenue and give you a comparison to the previous 2045 regional transportation plan. Now, these are somewhat apples to apples. I'll say maybe they're different varietals of our apples, because what we're looking at thus far, at least on our local side, is a local roadway transportation capital number. So we have not yet factored in maintenance at a local level. However, when we look at just the big picture numbers and kind of fuzz our eyes, what we're looking at is somewhere in the vicinity of $42.5 billion for the previous plan and around $72 billion for the current plan. So just to reiterate some of our next steps, I mentioned that anybody that has questions or comments today or in the days that follow today's meeting, we're happy to meet with folks or follow up on any questions that folks may have. We do have a couple of specific jurisdictional follow-ups to just validate some of the assumptions that have been made in putting together our methodology. And then we'll be kind of turning the page into some of the overall steps for the RTP, which I believe Will is going to cover next. But I want to pause there and just see if there are any additional questions or comments specific to this revenue discussion.
Thank you, Allison. Anybody have any questions? Kathy?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Allison, have y'all compared this grand total to other MPOs of similar size that are doing a 2050 plan to see whether we're in the ballpark or a big outlier or anything like that?
Kathy, no, we have not done that at this point, but that is certainly something that we will plan to do as we refine this number.
Kathy, are you meaning other MPOs in the state or state and outside of the state?
Oh, both. I mean, and you could look nationally. I'm just wondering, population size, geographic area. What are other people seeing? I'm just curious as to whether this is a dramatic increase, as has been pointed out. Are we seeing a trend of that across the state, across the nation? Are we the only people that have made a big jump? I just think that would be worth knowing.
Okay. Yeah, I think taking a look at San Antonio is probably a pretty good idea, since we'll have a lot of the same sort of things available to us.
Right, that would be a good one. Yeah.
Apples to apples comparison there. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Kathy. Just to see because we're somewhat on the conservative side, and I know y'all are shocked by some of the numbers, but we're conservative in what we assume.
Okay, well, that would
will probably be not just larger because they've got more revenue, but because they choose to change things that we don't change.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, that would be good to be able to show everybody, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Jacob? Jacob, did you have a question? I see your hand up. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Oh,
There it goes. Okay.
there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to just have a follow-up discussion outside of this one to talk through the revenue assumptions. It doesn't appear to be capturing the expenditures aspect of it, and so wanted to kind of talk through the difference in what we were expecting as a kind of cash on hand as versus the actual revenues that we accumulate through various fair and tax mechanisms.
Yeah, and Jacob, we can absolutely have a follow-up conversation. I think that's correct. At this point in time, everything is solely focused on the revenue side. We have not kind of crossed the Rubicon into the kind of balancing the expenditures with the available revenues, but absolutely happy to have a follow-up conversation to make sure that we're kind of getting the full picture.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have any questions for Allison? I think Will still had some information on this item. Okay.
Yep. So we're just going to, if nobody else has questions on the fiscal constraint component, I'm going to talk a little bit about the next steps in the RTP development process. And Joyce is also going to speak a little bit about some of the outreach that's currently happening throughout the region related to the RTP. So, like I said, between October and December of this year is the first round of public outreach meetings. Well, they'll actually be wrapping up in November, but there will be online commenting available, which Joyce will talk about through December of this year. Now, in November and December, we will be having discussions with agencies about the results of the fiscal constraint analysis relative to the project list. In December of this year, we're going to be going to the board to review draft revenue estimates, that is a fiscal limit, and provide an update on the development of the project list. Now, by the end of this year and early next, we will have a draft of the 2050 RTP, which we will then present to TAC in January, and then for information, followed by, I think that's actually supposed to say TPB information on the draft plan for February 2025. So following that, we'll have our second round of public outreach meetings to ask for a comment on the draft plan. Following that, in March of next year, we'll go to the TAC with our final plan for information, followed by a visit to the board for information in April, back to the TAC in late April for a recommendation on the final plan, and then finally to the board for action, that is adoption, in May 2025. With that, I'll turn things over to Joyce to talk about public outreach.
Thank you, Will. So as Will mentioned, there will be 2 public comment periods. Some of you may be new to TAC, and for the rest of us, it's been quite a few years since we've done this. So just a reminder that CAMPO's public participation plan, the PPP, requires a 2-phased approach to community outreach for the RTP. So the first public comment period started last week. We've already held 1 in-person event, and the other in-person events will be following in the next few weeks. The online open house was opened as well, and that will continue into December. In addition to participating in person or online, we also, the second phase, some of you may remember that we had to move the second phase of the RTP for 2045 remotely. And so we started offering commenting and information by mail, and also receiving voicemail comments. So we continue that practice for anyone who may not want to participate online but wants to receive the information. They will get a postage paid envelope that is addressed back to us, and they can send the survey or the comment cards back to us. And that's just an additional way for the public to be able to participate. We are holding public events in all 6 of the counties, and there will be a public hearing. The board will hold a public hearing prior to the RTP adoption next spring. All of the public comments will go to the board members prior to their consideration and deliberation next May, and then we will be able to summarize those comments for the TAC for y'all to be able to make that recommendation to the board next spring as well. Go to the next slide. So these are the outreach event locations. As I mentioned, we've already held 1 in-person event. That was this past Saturday in Kyle. This week we'll be in Georgetown, Manor, and Marble Falls. We'll be having an open house prior to the board meeting next Monday at the Junior League facility. And then we'll also be in Lockhart and in Bastrop in the coming weeks. So that is the information I have for the outreach on this, and Will, Allison, and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on this item? I don't see any other hands. So thank you all so much. That was a lot of great information. We'll go ahead and move to item number 4, discussion on the fall amendment cycle. Ryan?
Thank you. So just wanted to provide a brief update on the fall amendment cycle that's currently ongoing. Again, this is the regularly scheduled opportunity for which individuals, agencies can submit changes to the regional transportation plan as well as the transportation improvement program. And so we're here today for an information item. We are currently out along with the RTP for community outreach, which will conclude early next month. We're going to have a public hearing and information item at the November board meeting. And then after the public comment period closes, we'll summarize those comments and bring it back to the technical advisory committee for recommendation late November, and then take it to the policy board in December for approval. So I think it's always a good opportunity, for TAC members, just talk about the relationship between, talk about the relationship between the regional transportation plan and the TIP. We do amend both of them regularly, twice a year. And it's important because the regional transportation plan is where projects are going through the planning process, going through the NEPA process, and it provides that eligibility for federal funding. It's only when they receive that commitment of federal funding to a particular project that they are included in the transportation improvement program. So they can be taken to the policy board for approval because the policy board's approval and listing in TIP and STIP is what authorizes the funding and obligates it to a particular project. Go to the next slide. And so for this amendment cycle, we do have 12 regular TIP amendments. You'll see those listed in blue. A lot of these are aligning, these are TxDOT submissions that are aligning the transportation improvement program with the adopted unified transportation plan. It includes a couple of new projects. A few new other projects have been moved out of the TIP window, are going to be removed. And then we have 6 projects that are funded through additional federal discretionary programs, including the PROTECT program. There's an EV charging program, as well as 2 NEVI charging stations that are being funded through TxDOT's NEVI program. In addition to that, we do have 3 regular regional transportation plan amendments. Those are listed in green, and these will be the last individual amendments to the 2045 regional transportation plan. As we move into the 2050 plan that will be adopted in the spring, the amendments, we won't have an amendment cycle in the spring for the RTP. But I do want to point out that we'll have a TIP amendment cycle in the spring. And then any projects or amendments that are approved in the spring amendment cycle will be automatically adopted into the 2050 plan as necessary. So with that, I do want to remind everyone the deadline for the spring amendment cycle is November 13th. So if you have any requests, please make sure they're submitted by November 13th. And then we'll prepare those for the spring amendment cycle. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Ed, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Ryan, on the product on SH71, there, I guess is probably an overpass, and I don't know, show the product as being removed. Is there a way to maybe be more clear to saying this was being removed because it's a product that's moved to 2030?
I can certainly add some more clarification to the notes. Yeah, because that is a good point. It wasn't canceled or anything like that. It was just scheduled out a little further than it was originally.
Yeah, I know somebody who drives that every day. They'll be interested in it being moved out for 4 years. So, also the last 3 that have kind of a green highlighted areas, that those are engineering projects, and I was curious as to, has it been the practice to add all the cost or the construction cost as part of the TIP? Because it's a little bit misleading, I think, when you maybe it's misleading, is $250,000 at the last one for engineering of I guess maybe that's a toll road. Is that
that's a really good point, because we normally don't list the base, because that is the total project cost that's included on the YOE. So I'll make that
those 3. Yeah, I'm not saying that. Maybe just a note to say, these are engineering and I'm not sure if you even need to put the engineering cost on there, but maybe it's a little more clarity on those, because they're not scheduled to go, well, maybe they are scheduled to go in 2030, but that wouldn't qualify them in the tip. Is outside, so yeah, maybe just a little bit of clarity on those projects that they're engineering that are leading to a product that's being developed for 2030 implementation.
That's a good point, because yeah, these are regional transportation plan amendments only, and not going to be included in the TIP. And yeah, we don't list the phase and the RTP, so those shouldn't have been in there. So we'll get those. We'll clarify that, because yeah, we don't specify the phase and the RTP.
Okay, thank you for my nitpicking and taking those into account.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Any other questions or comments? No. Okay. Seeing none, we'll go to item 5, the discussion on the 2026-2029 project call.
Thank you. So just wanted to bring this item back. I think we discussed it at the last TAC meeting, but I think it's always a good opportunity to do a little advertising. And specifically in this presentation, I wanted to talk about the process that we use to evaluate the projects and provide the recommendation, because I don't think I really focused on that last time. And I think that's really critical to go through that process just to get everyone familiar. Because the last time we talked about this process was really in 2017. When we spent about a year going through that process with the TAC and putting together the process for the project call back then. But with that, I just want to point out, we've announced the project call, and the due date is December 20th, 2024. We've had 2 webinars, which are posted online if you didn't have a chance to attend those. And then we're also doing open office hours through October and November. So if you need to get in touch with me to discuss any of the questions you may have, that's a good opportunity for that. And so in the new year, we're going to spend about 4 months going through the readiness assessment project evaluation, and then we're going to be bringing that back to the TAC as we go through that process. And then with the ultimate intent to get this approved by the policy board on June 9th of next year. Go to the next slide. And just to remind you, this project call specifically is for carbon reduction funding as well as transportation alternative set-aside funding. The earliest we will be able to program projects is in fiscal year 2026, which starts October 1st of 2025. We do have approximately $68 million with which to program projects with. And because the eligibilities are very similar between the two, so we may mix and match how we program those projects. But again, this is for carbon reduction funding and transportation alternatives set aside. And the eligibilities for that, a good way of thinking about it is anything that really doesn't add capacity or increase single occupancy vehicle travel is probably eligible between one of the 2 programs. So this is the process that I was mentioning that we do. It's basically a 3-step process that leads into the 4th step, which is the recommendation, where we check eligibility. We go through readiness, which is to ensure that projects can actually be implemented as scheduled. And then we go through a benefit evaluation, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And then we develop the recommendation, which goes to the policy board. So on the next slide, we'll talk about we have the readiness assessment. We basically do and this is probably the larger lift in the application is going through readiness, and we look at 14 areas depending on the project type, whether or not if it's a non-construction planning project or a program, or if it's something that's either going to preliminary engineering or construction phase of a project. We look at these areas, and these are all to basically ensure, again, that the projects can move forward as awarded by the policy board. And then the project evaluation, I want to kind of talk about this process. This was, I'm not going to go through in detail, obviously, all the planning factors and process for the cost benefit analysis, but this is the breakdown that we approved back in 2017. We've got 7 categories of projects, and each one has a set of planning factors. These are performance measures with which we evaluate the project against, and then we also do a cost benefit analysis. Now, the cost benefit analysis will basically look at how much the project costs versus the travel time benefits and safety benefits that we receive from the project. The only exception to that being the transportation planning projects will not get a cost benefit analysis because there's not a project yet to evaluate. And then finally, the recommendation that we'll be bringing back as we get it developed, we basically look at the project score and combined rank, and we move down the list and we look at the funding source and eligibility, as well as the fiscal year of implementation and availability. And we combine all of that to put together a recommendation for the policy board to consider. So with that, I just wanted to, kind of bring that, all the information is available on the funding opportunities webpage. There's extensive information in the guide to regional transportation project selection. But if you have any specific questions, I think it's critical that the TAC is very familiar with it, specifically if you've not been involved with this process before. Because we're going to be leaning heavily on the technical advisory committee as we go through this in the spring and actually put that recommendation together. It's important that we have the TAC support and that they're familiar with the process to ensure that we're following the process that the board has adopted. So with that, that's a quick update on that. But if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Ed, you have a question or comment?
More of a comment. Ryan has done two good presentations that have been taped, and I think one thing that kind of came to mind was that he did say if for future project calls that may be happening with the STPG funds or Category 7 funds, that you may want to go ahead and listen to some of those or be part of the just looking at that application, because there is you can't do it within a month's time frame. You need to be really thinking about it, and so it give you a heads up for your staffing level on being able to fill out an application for the larger amount of money that will become available through the Category 7 project call. So I thought it was a good advice from Ryan, and those presentations are really good, and he outlines everything that will be used in the future project call as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. You actually read my mind. I actually skipped over a note that I had to mention that specifically. So after we complete this project call, we will immediately start the next project call for STBG funding. And we're going to be looking at upwards of $250 million for that project call. It will be using the exact same application and exact same process. And because of the length, amount of time and work it takes to put these applications together, I would go ahead and make that decision now, which projects you think you might want to consider submitting for STBG funding, and start developing those applications now, because you'll be well ahead of the game once we start this process next August. And because it is a lot of work, specifically the readiness, I think, is what takes the longest. So I would go ahead and start prepared now. And thanks for bringing that up, Ed.
Awesome. Nothing else. Kathy, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I'm sorry, Brian, I probably missed this, but when is your recommendation going to the board for this project call?
The final recommendation approval we're hoping to do in June, at the June board meeting. But we'll definitely have it it'll probably show up at the TAC first. I would say late the April TAC probably is when we'll have a draft of that for review at that point. That all depends on how many projects we get and how long it takes to go through that readiness assessment more than anything. Because we do have to get that right, but I think that's the goal right now is June for approval.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. Any other questions or comments on this item? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to item 6, report on transportation planning activities. Chad or Ryan?
Yeah, I'll take that one. We're going to provide a quick update on our project readiness corridor study program. We have a couple of folks here to provide quick updates on the FM 973 and 734 studies, but we also have Heather Ashley Wynn on. I don't know, Heather, did you want to provide any quick overview on the program or anything going on with that before we do specific corridors?
Give a little bit of update on kind of where we are with our PEPs and right-of-way utility budgets here at TxDOT. So we've been given I think it's the first time we've been given a 3-year outlook of our PEPSON right-of-way budget, which covers us through August of 25, which is a previous legislative appropriations request year biennium. And we've also been given our allocation that we're going to be requesting in this next LAR, which would cover us through 26 and 27. And so those budgets really are focusing on projects that are actually funded in the first part of the UTP, our 10-year program. And so really, we're having to kind of just focus our priorities and resources on that. And I know we had a few ongoing studies, so we really need to sit down and figure out how maybe CAMPO can offer up some of their study money from the, if you will, from the UTP allocation that was given from the 130 concession. So it's kind of a shift in terms of you know, who's going to be doing what. We still have the same priorities. We just need to figure out how we can get to them at the best appropriate time. And I know we are definitely still prioritizing the FM 973 north of 290. That's a funded schematic for us. And so I think it's the two that are, you have folks there to talk about today are the ones that we might need to just shift resources to more on the CAMPO side. Any questions?
Anyone have any questions on that? Doesn't look like it. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, so Joyce, did you want to provide a quick update on 734?
Sure. So 734 Parmer, that study is from MOPAC to 1431, and we had 3 open house and public comment periods scheduled. So we got through 2 of those before that pause occurred. So we're just kind of in a holding pattern at the moment. That's kind of where we are right now, is kind of paused after that second of 3 public comment periods. And we'll just wait and see how this plays out.
And we're on a similar holding pattern for the 969 study, although it hadn't really proceeded not nearly as far as the other studies that we've begun. But Brian, do you want to talk about 973?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Brian Duffy with PGE, representing the General Engineering Consultants, and we're helping oversee the 973 project, and that is from US 290 down in Manor all the way up to US 79 in Taylor. So far we've had several meetings with local governments, and we're currently working with the consultant team towards a 60% schematic. Right now we're scheduled to do our first public involvement in spring 2025, and we're hopeful to have the approved schematic done by the end of 2025.
That's our update on the project readiness program. That's all we have here for planning activities.
Awesome. Thank you, Chad. So next we'll go to TAC chair announcements. The next policy board meeting for everyone to note is November 4th at 2, and our next TAC meeting will be November 18th. And with